Does Plato anticipate Martin Luther? Might be a weird question, and yet in a very specific way, there might be a way you can say yes to this. Because Plato, in the Meno, Protagoras, and the Republic, argues that virtue can't be taught. And he seems to imply that you already need to be virtuous to do virtue, and there isn't a way to learn how to leave the cave and to look at the shadows unless you're kind of yanked out or something to that effect. Martin Luther basically agrees that you can't do the works of the law, can't do good works, unless you're already a good tree. And a good tree produces good fruit. Both Plato and Luther see a particular limit to virtue, that virtue is a really confusing thing, or righteousness is a confusing thing. It seems like everyone maybe wants to do it, but you can't do it. It's not something you can really just teach. I mean, granted, you can teach right and wrong in a general way, but unless someone finds himself yanked away from the cave, the shadow world, into the light, into the real world, unless someone is already a good tree, they cannot produce good fruit, or they cannot exit the cave into reality and to see virtue. Plato seems to even say that the only way you can really experience or gain virtue is through a sort of divine dispensation. And while he does sort of hint there must be a way to teach virtue or to have it as a body of knowledge, it really seems like he struggles to articulate how that works. It seems like he knows there's a particular limit, that every time you try to get virtue, every time you try to pursue it, every time you try to teach it, you realize it can't really be taught. There's some built-in limit to virtue or goodness or righteousness. And so he very carefully tries to articulate in the Republic a way for education to work. Perhaps you kind of avoid sort of, not so much that you'd avoid moral education, but you'd start to make the more certain things like mathematics. And then later you could maybe get into dialectics, where you ask questions about the nature of goodness and virtue and justice and so on. Really, if I remember correctly, once you're around the age of 30, if memory serves, in the Book of Republic. So early on, you're really not ready for it. And even then, it's still a bit ambiguous. Like, when can you really know and experience and become virtuous? And for Plato, it really seems like you need to be yanked out of that cave, and then you need to convert your desires to wanting to stay out of it. For Luther, it's, again, really, really similar. He distinguishes between civil righteousness or political righteousness and the righteousness of faith. There's a real sense in which you can do natural goods. You know, you can plan how a city looks, you can build safe roads, build a safe house. He's not really denying that. But when he talks about like a true, full, good work, one that is involves the righteousness of faith, not just the sort of the righteousness of works, just relying on doing good, which he seems to admit is hypothetically possible. You can do all sorts of external things that are basically good and right. And yet, they're not good and right. They are, we might call them, splendid vice. They're not full good works. There is some deep problem with them. There's always some sort of mixture of error, some sort of mixture of sin. Something's going on. They're not, according to Luther, you might say, he says that every single... what does he say again? He says something to the effect that evil inheres in every good work. Plato, because he views virtue as essentially one, and that there's this distribution of maybe forms of it, but there's virtue is essentially one, sort of has to admit the same. I'm not sure if he says it explicitly, but if virtue is one, and people sometimes are unjust and sometimes lack courage or whatever, that means in every single act of virtue, there is a misfire, sin. This ends up being pretty interesting. He has this whole, I can't remember if it's in the Republic or Protagoras, but he has this debate over lines of poetry, and there's one line that he's discussing where he says, look, I think it's in Protagoras actually, the two lines say something to the effect of, it is hard to become good, and then the poet disagrees with the statement that says it is hard to be good. And Plato says actually the poet's not contradicting himself. He actually agrees, because what he's saying is that it's hard to become good. It's hard to become virtuous. It's hard to become just. But once you are, by implication, it's not that hard. It's maybe easier. Again, Luther says you can't do good works. You can't produce good fruit unless you're already good, unless you're already a good tree. Well, these are really similar perspectives. Luther seems to agree that virtue is one, just like Plato agrees that virtue is one. Both seem to agree that it's basically impossible to become virtuous in this life. Both seem to agree that it's really hard to do an act of virtue. There's always some problem. Now, Plato seems to, he must have some answer that I haven't fully figured out yet, and I'm sure someone in the comments who is maybe a Plato expert can explain that to me. But it does seem like he basically says virtue cannot be taught. And there's a sense in which you should still try, but it's not clear how that actually works, whether someone will want to leave the cave of shadows into the real world, how that can actually happen. He does seem to admit that there must be a divine dispensation. Again, Luther believes that only through a divine gift can someone become a good tree from which they can do works of virtue. A fourth agreement between the two. And so there's a real sense in which Plato does anticipate Martin Luther, or Martin Luther maybe answers the question that Plato seeks to answer. Can virtue be taught? Obviously, they live in different contexts and they're doing different things, but there is a real connection. Both are very interested in righteousness or morality or justice. In fact, Plato's Republic's all about justice, and Martin Luther is obviously well known for his view of justice. That is, justice that we might say is imputed or given to us by faith. Usually we call it justification. They both are interested in the same question. They both believe that virtue is one. They both believe that you can learn it through divine dispensation. They both agree that it's very, very difficult to attain. They both agree that you already need to be good or virtuous before you do virtuous things. And yet Luther seems to have an answer about how that divine dispensation looks, where Plato just maybe leaves it a bit more ambiguous. For Luther, you can do all sorts of external or civil or political good deeds, and they can be real. I mean, you're helping someone in education, you're helping someone cross the road, you're helping someone safely build a house. You're not denying that those are good, but there is something missing, that because you're a bad tree, or in Plato's language, virtue is one, because not everyone's perfectly virtuous, doesn't have an experience of virtue, that essential supreme good. Well, then you're always doing something that is categorically not good or not virtuous, until two things happen. One, grace comes, which is a gift that removes fully the wrath of God from you, the threat of punishment. And then secondly, the gift of faith, which Luther says in Against Latimus is infused into us, and that this gift is the thing that destroys the pollution of sin or vice. So faith, grace first comes and removes any sort of threat of judgment, so that you are, in terms of the divine mind, you are viewed as declared good. And then faith is this divine gift, this divine dispensation in Plato's language, that is given to you, that makes you day by day virtuous. It destroys this corruption of vice, so that eventually, at the end of all things, perhaps not fully in this life, but in the next life, when you meet God in the resurrection, you can be truly that good tree that you're declared to be in a full sense. And then you will know goodness itself, and you'll know that virtue is one, and you will know that you are good, and you only do good. Not only are you declared and viewed as fully good, but that faith that has grown in you, that divine gift or divine dispensation, is the very thing that allows you to leave the cave, So you no longer look at the shadow realm. You're no longer content with the passions and desires of just the phenomenological world around you. You're no longer content with just the regularities of life and all things. But you are able to get up and to see the light and to see that there's just statues being carried by people behind you, casting shadows on the wall, and you're able to leave the shadowland and to go into the true world. And when you do, and you see that light, that illuminating light of nature which comes from the light, which is God, you begin to realize that there is something beyond space and time, that there is deeper realities beyond what you can see, feel, and touch. And for Luther, he might not use that analogy, of course, but he would identify that as knowing God through faith in Jesus Christ by the Holy Spirit. That is the thing that is a divine dispensation and gift, not only the grace of forgiveness that destroys wrath, but the gift of faith infused in us that destroys the pollution of sin. Whereas grace is outside of us, extranos, outside of us, that removes the threat of punishment. Faith is a gift inside of us, all from God, faith in Christ, still that renovates our inner life. And so that every time we nurture faith through prayer, through the Eucharist, through baptism, through preaching, through all these kinds of things, what you are doing is you're growing that thing that is infused into your soul, that faith, that divine dispensation, so that you can destroy the pollution of sin or evil or vice, so that you can come more increasingly to realize that you can in fact do works of virtue, because you are declared to be a good tree. And only someone who's good can do good works. Only someone who's already virtuous can do virtue, as Plato says, and as Martin Luther said. So yes, to a degree, I think it is accurate to say that Plato, at least on a very specific question, anticipates Martin Luther. Both get to the same limit when it comes to the limits of righteousness or virtue. Both agree that that virtue is whole or righteousness is whole. You have to be a good tree or you have to be wholly virtuous. Both agree that you can't attain righteousness or virtue easily on your own. It can't be taught, it can't be learned. Both agree that there must be sort of a divine dispensation. Both agree that you need to have some sort of conversion. So you need to be dragged out of the cave, as it were, to see the light, because you want to see the shadows. And yet Luther is the more specific of the two, that he believes that the infusion of faith into your soul, well, to your whole self, body and soul, really, but the inner self typically we associate with the soul. The infusion of faith into the soul is the very thing that is renovating the inner person that you are, so that because you are declared to be a good tree, you can in fact produce good fruit. Because you are in fact virtuous, you can in fact do virtue. All that to say, read Plato, then read Martin Luther, and you'll be able to see these interesting connections. If you want a list of recommended works, I think for Plato you could read the Meno, Protagoras, the Republic. These are 3 dialogues that all talk about can virtue be learned in general. There's different topics within those. And then if you want to read Luther, read him on his Galatians commentary, Galatians 3:10, in particular, that whole section there, and read his Against Latimus. If you want to read a book on this, it doesn't quite say as explicitly as I did, but you can read this book by Gilbert Meilander, The Theory and Practice of Virtue. He has a chapter on Plato and a chapter on Luther. That kind of got me thinking in this direction, and then I've been reading both of them this week, and it does actually seem to be a really interesting correlation between the two. I kind of hope to do some writings on this. I have 3 articles that I want to write, so you can look forward to those in the future. And if I remember, I will come back to this YouTube channel and I will put the links to those articles in the description so you can maybe see the written sources spelled out, so that it's not just my summary, but you can see the words of the authors themselves and the connections made.